Hello, friends. Welcome you to this smooth MOOC on universal design, accessibility planning, and social inclusion. These MOOC modules have been created under the Global Center of Spatial Methods for Urban Sustainability at the Technical University of Berlin, funded by the German Academic Exchange Services, that is, the DAAD. These modules have been curated under the aegis of Laboratory of Inclusive Design at IIT Roorkee. Friends, my name is Professor Gaurav Raheja, and I am a professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning at IIT Roorkee. In this module, session B of module 2, we shall focus the continuation of understanding diversity and disability, and in this specific module, we shall be talking about the broader dimensions of disability. The types, the needs, and the kind of barriers. Disability is a broader notion, sometimes also referred as the disablement process. Friends, it's important for us to understand this concept because in the practices of various environmental conditions that we possibly interact with, it is crucial that this understanding provides us the dimensions and the way forward for how people with disabilities could be included into the larger environments. Having said this, let's go forward with this module. You can see an image of various persons with disabilities representing various typologies. Friends, many a times disability is referred to only one or two types of impairments in a general common understanding. It is therefore important that we start appreciating the fact that disabilities are also diverse. There are sensory disabilities of visual impairments, there are sensory disabilities of hearing senses, and there are, of course, locomotor disabilities and many more. And these diversities actually further create a perspective for us that when we are conditioning or designing or thinking about environments, we cannot just limit to only one typology of the understanding. Having said this, it's again little going backwards to understand that the whole history of the subject of disability rests on many facets of historic movements by people themselves. However, you must be familiar with the symbol that is shown to you right now. Now, this symbol, which otherwise represents a person on a wheelchair, designed by Suzanne Kufid, a Danish design student, was adopted by the 11th World Congress on the Rehabilitation of the Disabled. The symbol, which is now represented as the International Symbol of Access, was introduced in 1969. The world has moved forward, and so has the concept of disability. We have another symbol which is designed by Sarah Hendren and Brian Glenley as part of the Accessible Icon project. What is the distinction between this symbol and the one that we saw previously? This symbol tries to display and iconify an active, engaged image with the focus on person with disability rather than a very stable kind of, I would say, a stern image, which was the previous one. This image positions the human in action as a very positive shift from the previous image. But the world is moving further. As the United Nations accessibility icon, here is the image with the human in the center. You again see with few dots around in the circle. It is to represent the non-mobility related disabilities and other forms of human diversity through iterations of universal human figure. On a parallel note, the company Apple also uses the symbol of universal access as a full human body. So it's important to see while these are symbols, friends, these are symbolic shifts towards a progressive understanding of the whole notion of the term disability. And it's important that we start appreciating this, that disability itself is very diverse. Having said this, coming from the Indian context, India has moved forward leaps and bounds in this whole sector of disability from its earlier understanding. 1995, India got its first legal act, which was titled as the Persons with Disabilities Act. However, few years later, almost 20 years or 2 decades, in 2016, a new act was introduced, which is titled as Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, popularly known as the RPWD Act. What was the shift? While there are many shifts to talk about in terms of rights, a very critical shift was that in the earlier act we had 7 types of disabilities recognized. In this new act of 2016, now 21 types of disabilities got a recognition. And isn't that a significant milestone? Because as part of this, one could realize the expanse of this number basically reflects a larger set of people getting included. Consequently, we could say it is a stretch towards accepting a larger variety, more diverse people with disabilities under the ambit of this act itself. What do these 21 disabilities look like? Well, let me read out some of these names to you. First one, blindness, low vision, leprosy cured persons, hearing impairment, locomotor disability, intellectual disability, mental illness, acid attack victims, dwarfism, autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, chronic neurological conditions, specific learning disabilities, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, speech and language disability, thalassemia, hemophilia, sickle cell disease, and in multiple disabilities including deaf blindness. I'm sure many nations have their own limited or perspectives towards disability, and there is a lot that we all keep learning from various nations in the global south and in the global north. However, in this progressive series, I personally feel that Indian step towards expanding these nature of disabilities is a direction of engaging a more inclusive direction for our environments to respond now. The various terms and definition in this set of act is something that we are now going to discuss. But before we do that, it's important to know why are we talking about this? Friends, we are talking about this because the legal is the rights-based approach. And this rights-based approach forms the ground for various actions that can happen in a nation. So unless we clarify what do they mean, the terminological understanding, we would sometimes miss out on the soft interpretations between a certain action and a certain policy. So it's part of a policy reading or a policy understanding that this grounded knowledge of the fundamentals of rights of persons with disabilities is important. I otherwise invite you to also have a look on this online so that you can have the full act at your disposal to read. However, we will take about few terms and definitions on these idea of disability so that the basic understanding is developed. Person with disability. What does it mean and how is it defined in this act? A person with a long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairment which, coupled with different barriers around her or him, hinders her or his fulfill an effective participation in society equally with others. And this is how we understand who the person with disability is. This represents again the various typologies and various dimensions through which we are going to see this lens of disability. It is not limited to only one kind of disability, which sometimes we interpret through the symbol of a wheelchair user. The Act introduces another term which says person with benchmark disabilities. Friends, as you might already know, that disabilities in the medical sense are measured, and through that measurement, it's defined by a certain percentage of your ability or your limitation. So, a person with benchmark disability is defined by this act as a person with not less than 40% of a specified disability as recognized by the RPWD Act 2016 and as certified by the certifying authority. So it is important that any national state government which recognizes a person with benchmark disabilities needs to ensure that the disability borderline is 40%. It has to be more than 40%. Anybody less than that will not be considered as a person with benchmark disabilities. And if you look at this, this is how we have the visualized version of that. And the specified disability has not been defined in measurable terms, or a person with disability where specified disability has been defined in a measurable term. A person with benchmark disability who needs high support. So within the categories of disability or benchmark disability, now there is a additional term which defines the idea of people who need high support. So physical, psychological or otherwise to carry out activities of daily living, access services or facilities and to take decisions. In all these facets where you need high support, a person, this is also further defined as a person with benchmark disability who needs high support. The Act purposely defines a term called reasonable accommodation. As the term itself implies, reasonable accommodation means any adjustment or modification made without imposing any disproportionate or undue burden to ensure that persons with disabilities exercise their rights equally with others. Equally with others is something to be emphasized. That is the spirit of inclusivity. Reasonable accommodation directs us or guides us towards this notion that treating people with disabilities in an equitable manner. Let's be reasonable to accommodate, right, without imposing any disproportionate. So it's also a perspective of greater understanding of the context, and it believes that the humans, the society, and the larger environment shall be reasonably accommodating the needs of persons with disabilities equally with the other sections of society. And these expectations definitely can be achieved better through the use of assistive technologies and better design of our own environments. Now, if you look at in a quicker way, disabilities can also be grouped in the categories of visible or invisible disabilities. Friends, yes, persons with locomotor disabilities who possibly have lower limb challenges or are in the visible domain of category are perhaps well known, which also includes many other forms and reasons. So let's also understand that to acquire and have a disability is one thing, but the reasons of disability could be many things, right? So it could be due to the polio virus that one could be affected in lower limbs, one could have amputation, one could have spina bifida or any other form of medical ailment because of which you could be in a situation of disability. And some of these are visible that you can see, but it is well evidenced that a large number of disabilities are also invisible, and that is really a big challenge because most decisions of environments also have to reflect an accommodation for people with invisible disabilities. A large number of this includes disabilities of cognitive nature, blood disorders, neurodiverse conditions, including hearing impairment as well, many a times. And therefore, it's conscious that we are attempting through this module to sensitize our audience that let's be aware, and therefore this whole idea of not being judgmental is very important. Now, the nature of disability includes upper limb amputees, ambulant disabilities, or wheelchair users in the physical form. Sensory disabilities include the visual impairment, auditory impairment, the speech impairment, while the neurodiverse and the cognitive forms of disability include dyslexia, autism spectrum disorder, developmental coordination disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, amnesia, dementia, and few others. So if you broadly look at disabilities by themselves are a very specialized domain of understanding, and each disability brings along with it a set of special needs. So we need to have a look at that visually now. The ambulant disabilities may include people with lower limb challenges, but they are in a condition to move by themselves with some assistive support. A wheelchair user essentially is somebody who's instead of using the lower limbs is using wheels to be moving. And likewise, there can be disabilities of the upper limb, and many other dimensions are possible within the sense of physical disabilities. While in the case of vision related disabilities, there are people who sometimes experience glaucoma, sometimes they experience diabetic retinopathy experiences, and many a times we have a large common situation of low vision. Now, these disabilities are not really in a visible spectrum, but and each of them also is very distinct. Contrary to a sometimes common view that visual impairment only means blindness, well, that's not true. It is different kinds of visual challenges that one suffers with, and therefore it's important to see how each of them is addressed in our environment. Looking at this, you'll find that there are a lot of vision impairment related challenges which are defined also in a measurement way. They are measured in terms of visual acuity, which ranges from a mild, moderate, severe to a complete blindness, which is 6 by 12 to 6 by 18 is a mild set of disability. As we know, the perfect eyesight is a 6 by 6 eyesight. Similarly, about persons with hearing impairments, what do they do when they have to communicate with each other? Well, it depends on where they are, what kind of technology support we have, but at the same time, lip reading, sign language, and use of hearing aids are one of the few of the common things well known as assistive methods of engaging with persons with hearing impairments. Likewise, there is a degree of hearing loss which is measured in decibels, which ranges between again a profound loss is 91 plus decibels to a normal situation which is ranging between minus 10 to 15 decibels, while the mild deafness starts from 26 to 40, moderate from 41 to 55, and likewise severe to 71 to 90. Depending on the range of loss, one accommodates a certain kind of assistance, both from the environment as well as in terms of technologies which are recommended by the right specialists, so that the hearing disability can be mitigated for in terms of some of these losses. Looking at this further into the speech related disorders, we'll find stuttering, voice disorders, lisping, apraxia, dysarthria, etc. So as to understand that within the speech disorders also there are various kinds. And if you look at all of them, you'll find they can sometimes cause an impact on the interaction and the hearing. And this needs an environmental support to acknowledge and make it inclusive. Cognitive disability, which is when a person has a certain limitation in mental functioning and in skills such as communicating, taking care of themselves, and social skills, which includes broadly a neurodiverse category and cognitive impairment. Neurodiversity here refers to the approach to learning and disability that argues diverse neurological conditions are the result of normal variations in the human genome. So, this argument basically positions us into a perspective that accepting disability as another form of human diversity is the most common way to address it, or is the most reasonable way to address it. Many a times, as we learned in the previous module, that disability many a times is reflected or is seen as a charitable idea, which is about victimization, is perhaps not the right thing to do. And this is what, in the sense of reasonable accommodation, also we are trying to say is that it is a result of human variations in the genome, and there could be other reasons as well. But because disability has for long stayed with a word called stigma, and because of which many a times the right interventions are not available to include people with disabilities, it is important to understand this in the larger way, spectrum of things. Neurodiverse and cognitive impairments, which further define, as we have already mentioned about this, dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, DCD, ASD, Tourette syndrome, dementia, delirium, amnesia, and epilepsy are wide spectrum, and each of them has a defined um, role and defined set of needs from the medical side as well as from the support side. And this appreciation of diversity within a singular kind of disability itself, I feel, will be a welcome step in our sensitization. You look at it further, persons with mental illness, this includes anxiety disorders, bipolar disorders, depressive disorders, eating disorders, as they say, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, sleep wake disorders, they're all, and in few nations, even stress has been included as one form of disability. Because of this, now we move further into the section of the needs and the barriers that possibly people with disabilities might face. So, if you look at broadly their needs, there could be a detailed understanding of that. But to bring it in a concise form, we are bringing this that if you see on the table shown in the slide, on the upper row is the typology of disabilities defined as a user group, and on the left hand side in the column we have broad set of characteristics which require attention. So, difficulty in interpreting information. Who all face this? People with hearing impairments, people with visual impairments, people with cognitive impairments, and persons with neurodiverse conditions. Poor or complete degradation of sight. Well, we find that persons with visual impairments largely have this need. Poor or complete degradation of hearing, it's usually people with hearing impairments. Well, they could also be people with aging. Prevalence of poor balance is persons with physical injuries, upper and lower body conditions, including wheelchairs. Prevalence of poor coordination and orientation. Again, persons with cognitive and visual impairments possibly reflect that disability characteristic. Likewise, poor or inability in handling oneself, poor or inability in using upper extremities, poor or inability in using lower extremities, limitations of stamina and limitations of strength, while they all could be challenges with sometimes able bodied people also, but it's important to see it in light of disability that most of these lie under the domain of physical disabilities with limb, upper or lower limb challenges. In terms of the vertical and horizontally challenged in terms of height and weight, we will find this is usually a condition we find with persons with on wheelchair users developing this due to long sedentary seatings. Requiring physical assistance or supervision, almost all categories of disabilities may sometimes require assistance in some form or the other. But this can be defined even in greater detail for each type of disability. Requiring family friendly facilities, well, even though we have not mentioned anything in this column here, we believe it's a basic expectation for all disabilities or for all human selves to be socially growing up, you know, family friendly facility. At the same time, use of movement aids, we find people with visual impairments and especially wheelchair users and even persons with physical injuries also would require this as a form of human need. While use of walking cane to detect obstructions, etc., is something that persons with visual impairments would require. Now, moving forward, the basic activities of daily living, which we refer to them as ADLs. Whenever we are looking at persons with disabilities, their performance, their participation has to be seen from the lens of what all activities they are able to participate in. This includes personal hygiene, feeding, continence management, ambulating, dressing, toileting. Further, the the WHO and the ICIDH further define things as instrumental activities of daily living, which is a step ahead of the basic to let an individual live independently in a community. These include companionship and support, managing household, transportation and shopping, managing medications and finances, preparing meals, communicating with others. The idea is to see how the shaping of the environment and the support provided by it for various kinds of disability needs is able to provide us with this direction. Now, what do we understand by the term barriers? Barriers can be classified in various ways. They are attitudinal or social or organizational. They can be information and communication barriers. There are technology driven barriers, and also, predominantly, we also see in the environment physical barriers. All these barriers, therefore, require different approaches to also address them. Having recognized these barriers, it's it's our responsibility through understanding on what strategies do we apply to overcome these barriers so that people with disabilities can actually participate in the environment. Now, in terms of built environment, what are the broad needs? For a very, I would say, basic understanding, we would classify them in four broad categories. One is the need for information and communication to move, to navigate, and to experience built environment. Second is mobility by itself. We need infrastructure, we need spaces with the right elements such that we can move. But moving with ease, moving with equal opportunities, moving with accessibility are all requirements by building, designing, and creating the mobility infrastructure in the right way. Then is the broader infrastructure, which is the physical built spaces by themselves or different kinds of built environment infrastructure. For example, education infrastructure, health infrastructure, housing infrastructure, public space infrastructure, workspace infrastructure, and so on and so forth, including sports and recreational infrastructure. All these infrastructures by themselves, including tourism, hospitality, need to reflect upon the fact that how they're addressing the needs of persons with disabilities in an inclusive manner. And then, very important is the services. Friends, while all other kinds of needs like information, mobility, infrastructure, in one sense can be non living or basically non animated needs. The point here is that service provision is an integral part of all these sections of the environment as well. And these services could be provided by humans, they could be provided by technologies, they could be provided through a digital lens, they could be provided through artificial intelligence, or they could be provided through policy support as well. So if you see, it's a very interesting thing to see how services overlay the larger environment, and that brings the whole built environment together. In terms of infrastructure needs, now let's look at some of these examples through visuals. The staircase, the handrails, they need all these support systems, the treads, the risers, etc., which we shall talk further as part of the need. Looking at the transport systems within the same infrastructure using assistive technology, adaptive vehicles as part of transferring from the ground level to the next level of the boarding the car itself or the taxi. Similarly, navigational needs for persons with visual impairment so that they can walk safely to their destinations. The acoustic environments of our indoor spaces for the creation of any kind of visual, auditory, or a performance experience where sound is an important role playing element, I think requires this acoustic need to be taken care of fairly well. The needs for person with low vision to have glare-free environments is also a very crucial dimension. Persons using wheelchairs with mobility aids need doors, entrance openings that allow movement with minimal effort. Similarly, mobility needs, including persons with physical disabilities and others needing safe means of public transport, access to railways, access to road transportation, access to other means of public transport systems, becomes a crucial part of the understanding mobility needs in these environments. Likewise, an element as critical as the curbs, the curb ramps, and the curb cuts in the streets for pedestrian infrastructure becomes a very crucial element for seamless transitions in streets and crossings. For persons with visual impairments, the challenges in identifying and boarding the public transit systems remains a critical domain to be worked upon, for which various assistive technologies can be deployed, along with creating a mobility infrastructure in a way that these needs are responded to in a very careful manner. Likewise, for persons with visual impairments, safe crossings in streets is an, is an expectation of responding to their needs in an inclusive way. Wayfinding from obstruction free pathways using cane detection, etc., requires the environments to be again responsive in a meaningful manner. Information and communication needs include things like signage, which is which has several elements to a signage. A signage has a language, it has a visual iconography, and many a times it also has the right tactile information embedded into it. And this is requiring to have sufficient contrast and legibility so that it could be read well by a diverse range of people. Similarly, as I said, braille and other tactile means enable persons with visual impairments to perceive information in a complete, comprehensive manner. Persons with visual impairments also need, I would say, an existing assistive technology which is text to speech, through which whatever is the text available in a digital form can actually be spoken up by the machine and forms a form of accessibility. Persons with hearing impairments need support from visual sign language, which communicates the entire language through the right structure and grammar in an inclusive manner. Persons with hearing impairments also need visual cues in the case of emergencies. So, a flashlight is a good example to consider that as a need for persons with hearing impairments. In terms of service needs, as we also discussed, mobility support assistance is a need based on the disability that requires you to move on the wheelchair sometimes in a condition of higher dependence. Likewise, digital assistance services is a need for day-to-day ease of living. Today we have digital or AI based chatbots and many other things to support us in our digital sequence through even search engines. Likewise, the support needs extend to the kind of services through elevators, and there are also situations which poses barriers. When you see all these steps as part of the integrated landscape, and we find that all steps look like the same, uh, with low visual contrast, such that person on wheelchair cannot climb up as a consequence. This is a human condition. So to represent these human conditions in one is assisted with a mobility alternative of an elevator, and the other where steps become a barrier to a person on wheelchair requires us to put this in perspective. So it is to say, if an impairment is supported with an accessible environment, it possibly can lead to inclusion, as shown in this image, including things like digital technologies, which were developed, for example, the Alexa, for persons with visual impairments to work on voice commands, essentially is now used by all. So, overall, all we are trying to communicate here is that the various kinds of disabilities can be addressed by various kinds of environmental support, and therefore we should not mistake all disabilities as one type of needs. Where different needs, different support systems require integration in order to achieve the right kind of inclusion. Friends, towards the end, we shall now move to the Module 2, Section C, with the title Diversity, Types, Needs and Barriers as the next module session. For this module or for this session, we shall say goodbye for now and see you in the next session. Until then, thank you so much for a very patient listening and participation.